In this session, we are going to learn about return values and scope in Python. I explained a little bit about return values, but since this is an important topic, I decided to do more examples on return values. So a return value is how a function sends results back to you, and a scope is about where variables live. In other means, which parts of your program can see them. Both are essential. Return values let us reuse results, and scope keeps our variables safe and organized. So let's start with a simple example and a simple return. So in this example, we want a function that calculates the square of a number and returns it instead of just printing. So we start by defining a function. We give it a name. Then we save it in a variable called result. For example, let's do 5 and print this. Print result. So when we call square 5, Python multiplies 5 by 5 and returns the result. That result gets stored in result, and when we print it, we see 25. Let's see what happens. The key difference here, using return means we can save the value and use it later instead of just printing it once. So in the next example, I would like to talk about early return. In this example, we want a function that checks whether a number is even or odd and returns immediately once it knows the answer. So again, we start with defining a function. We give it a name. Let's do check number, for example. The number is n, and we are trying to find whether this number is even or odd. So we do have if function here. The number is divisible by 2. That's 0. So return even, otherwise return odd. So let's try it. Parent check number. Let's check 20, for example, and let's do another odd number. Check number. This time let's do 7. Let me run this, and the first one is even, the second one is odd. So when we pass 20, the function checks whether 20 is divisible by 2, which is true, so it returns even right away. When we pass 7, the first condition fails, so Python skips to the next line and returns odd. Notice how the function stops as soon as it hits a return statement. Now let me talk about local scope. By working on an example. So in this example, we want to see what happens when we define a variable inside a function and then try to use it outside. For example, let me define a function. Let's call it my function. And this is what I want from the function to do for me. Just do a message like hello from inside and print it. So let me run this function. Let me call that and print So when we call my function, it creates a local variable message with the value hello from inside. Inside the function, we can print it just fine. But when we try to print message outside, Python throws an error because the variable only exists inside the function. That's local scope. So we see that error as an output. Now let's talk about global scope. Now let's define a variable outside the function and see if the function can use it. So I am going to define this variable greeting hello world, and let me define a function. Let's call it say hello and print greeting, and let me call this function say hello and let me run this. So here greeting is a global variable. The function say hello can see it even though it was defined outside. So when we call the function, it prints hello world. Now let me work on another example about modifying global variables. So in this example, we want to increase a global counter from inside the function. Let's define a variable count, initial value 0, define a function increment con equals con plus 1 and print cont. Let me call this function so let me run this. So this gives an error. Why? Because when Python sees cont equals cont plus 1, it assumes cont is a local variable inside the function, but it hasn't been defined yet locally, so we get an unbound local error. Even though we had a global cont, the function didn't see it. Now let's talk about modifying globals with global. In this example, we want to fix the last example so the function can actually update the global variable. How do we do that? Let's do it again. Cont equals 0. Define increment global cont equals cont plus 1 and print cont. Let's call increment. Actually, let me call it another type, increment. So now we added the keyword global cont. This tells Python, don't make a new local variable, use the global one. So when we call increment, the first time cont goes from 0 to 1. When we call it again, it goes to 2. In this example, I would like to talk about local variables, or let's say local overrides global. And in this example, we want to see what happens when both global and local variables share the same name. Let's define a variable like message, and let's just do it like hello from outside, and then define show message. Then again, I would like to have this variable as both global and local variable. So again, hello from inside, print message. Let me call this show message, and let me run this. Actually, after calling, let me print this as well. Print message. So here we have two variables named message. Inside the function, Python uses the local version, so it parents hello from inside. Outside the function, the global message is still hello from outside. This shows how local scope overrides global scope inside the function. Now let's work on a practical example on counting function calls. In this example, we want a function that remembers how many times it's been called. So let me define a variable counter. The initial value is 0. Then define a function call me global counter and return counter. So let me print call me let me do it another time. Print call me and one more time to see what happens. So here we use a global variable counter and update it each time call me is called. First call, counter goes from 0 to 1. Second call, it goes from 1 to 2. And third call, the counter goes from 2 to 3. The function returns the updated value each time. So in summary, return gives results back to the caller. A function can return one value, multiple values, or return early. A scope controls where variables exist. Variables inside functions are local. Variables outside are global. Functions can read globals, but they cannot modify them without global. If local and global names clash, the local one wins inside the function. Best practice is basically prefer using return values instead of modifying globals because it keeps functions cleaner and safer.